On July 23, 1980, 31-year-old Helen Hagnes stood with her husband Janis outside their apartment building on New York's Upper West Side. Helen kissed Janis and told him she would see him later, and then she turned and began walking to work. It was early evening, and Helen could already tell it was going to be another hot New York summer night. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was humid. As Helen walked, she could already feel herself starting to sweat, and she just hoped she would still look okay when she got to work. She was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, but her platinum blonde hair and makeup were perfectly styled, like she was going to a formal event. And in her hand, Helen carried an oblong case that held her most prized possession in the whole world, her violin. Helen had grown up as a musical prodigy, becoming an award-winning pianist at the age of 4 and a skilled violin player at the age of 8. Now, Helen was a highly accomplished violinist, and she had performed with symphonies and opera and ballet companies all over Europe and North America. Helen made her way through the city and eventually turned onto a street about 10 blocks from her house. Up ahead, she saw the Metropolitan Opera House, or the Met as it's known, and her face lit up. Helen had dreamed about playing violin at the Met ever since she was a little girl, and she still couldn't believe that she was getting paid to come to this beautiful opera house to work alongside some of the most talented artists in the world. She turned onto a side street that led around the Met, and she entered through the backstage door. She smiled at a few Met employees and stagehands who were rushing back and forth getting ready for the night's ballet performance. Then Helen walked down a long, brightly lit hallway and went into the dressing room that was reserved for the women in the orchestra. Some of the other musicians had already arrived, and they all talked and laughed while they got dressed. Helen opened her locker and changed out of her street clothes into a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. She took a blue flower from her locker and fastened it to her hair with a bobby pin. Then, a little before 8 p.m., about an hour after she had arrived, Helen took her place in the orchestra pit with the rest of the musicians. The roar of the applause flooded the theater, the house lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and the orchestra conductor turned to the musicians and waved his hand. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. Even after all these years of playing, she still got nervous and excited. She raised her violin to her shoulder, placed her bow on the strings, waited for her cue, and started to play. About 40 minutes later, Helen heard the audience applauding once again. She had lost herself in the music like she always did, and so the first act of the ballet had sort of flown by in a blur. The curtain closed and the lights came up. It was the first of 2 intermissions. Helen placed her prized violin on her chair in the orchestra pit and headed backstage. She wasn't playing for the next section of the performance, and so she had an extended break. Helen walked right to the backstage elevator. She wanted to meet with the lead male dancer in the ballet, a famous Russian named Valery Panov. The elevator doors opened, and Helen stepped inside and stood between a man and a young ballerina. Helen told the ballerina she was going to see Panov, but she couldn't remember where his dressing room was. The ballerina said she didn't know either. Panov was a huge star, and he had his own dressing room that was separate from the rest of the dancers. Then the man chimed in and said Panov was on the 3rd floor. Helen thanked him, hit the button for the 3rd floor, and the elevator doors closed. The young ballerina stepped off the elevator at her dressing room floor. Then Helen rode up another floor, got off the elevator, and walked down a long hallway in search of Panov's dressing room. At 11:30 p.m., almost 3 hours after Helen got off that elevator, her husband Janis sat outside the Met in his van. Janis often picked his wife up to drive her home because walking at night in New York City in 1980 could be dangerous. Janis watched the dancers, musicians, and employees filing out of the Met, but he didn't see Helen. So he figured maybe she was still talking to one of her friends in the dressing room. But when it got to be midnight and Helen still had not come outside, Janis thought maybe she was getting a ride home with someone else and she had just forgotten to let him know. So he hopped out of his van, went to the nearest payphone, and called home. But there was no answer. So Janis figured there just must have been some miscommunication between him and his wife, and he headed home. A few minutes later, Janis walked into his and Helen's apartment, and it was empty. Janis thought it was a bit strange Helen wasn't home yet, even if she did get a ride home with someone else. But he figured maybe they had grabbed a drink before heading this way. Then he heard a knock at the door. This had to be Helen, and she must have forgotten her key or something. Janis went to the front door and opened it up, and suddenly he started to get worried. Because a nervous-looking man stood at the door with Helen's violin case in his hands. He said that he and some of the other musicians who played with Helen were really freaked out because Helen had left the orchestra pit during the first intermission and she never came back. He said a group of people had called the apartment and searched for Helen after the show, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Giannis took Helen's violin case and he closed his eyes like he was fighting back tears. He knew his wife would never just leave her violin behind somewhere, not even at the Met. In a flat, quiet voice, Giannis thanked the man for coming by. Then he closed the door, put down Helen's violin case, and went to the phone and called the police. In the early morning of July 24th, several hours after Giannis called the police, Detective Jerry Giorgio of the NYPD walked into the lobby of the Met. The two officers who had arrived first greeted him and showed him the photo they had of Helen Hagnes. Detective Giorgio looked at the photo and heard the lobby doors open behind him. He turned and saw a frantic-looking young woman running in. Giorgio held up his hand to try to get her to slow down and asked if she was okay. She introduced herself and said she was a ballerina in the performance. She had heard about Helen going missing from one of her friends, and she thought she might be able to help, because she was pretty sure she was one of the last people who had seen Helen. The ballerina said that she and Helen happened to be on the backstage elevator together during the first intermission, and Helen had mentioned she was on her way to visit with Panov. Detective Giorgio asked who Panov was. The ballerina smiled and said Valery Panov was one of the most famous male ballet dancers in the whole world. Giorgio thanked her and said her information was a huge help. He got the ballerina's information and told her he would contact her if he needed anything else. As the ballerina walked away, Giorgio handed the photo of Helen back to the two officers and told them to wait there in case anyone else showed up. Then he walked further into the grand lobby of the Met, and the design of the place was like nothing he had ever seen. The huge staircases leading to the higher floors almost looked like they led to nowhere and just disappeared into the darkness. Giorgio had just started to search the lobby when a security guard walked in and introduced himself. His boss had told him to come down and help the police if they needed it. Giorgio was relieved. He said he didn't want to waste any time. He needed a full tour of the opera house. But at this, the security guard busted out laughing. He said that would be impossible. The building was massive, with 6 stories above ground and 3 basements below. And there were so many hallways and hidden rooms that navigating the Met was like walking through a maze. Giorgio said they would get as many cops as they needed to comb through the whole place, but in the meantime, he at least wanted a tour of the backstage area where Helen would have gone during intermission. So the security guard led Giorgio into the theater, up onto the stage, and into the wings. Giorgio looked around the expansive backstage area, and he saw giant set pieces, black curtains hanging everywhere, multiple exits, and an elevator. Then he walked down a stairwell and found himself in a vast, dimly lit basement that made him feel like he was in a horror movie. Giorgio saw cases for double bass instruments that were bigger than him leaned up against the wall. And scattered throughout the basement, he saw old set pieces from past performances and large wooden crates filled with costumes and props. Giorgio started to feel overwhelmed. He thought if the worst had happened, if Helen was dead, her body could be in a crate or an instrument case or in one of the countless dark corners, hiding just out of view. At around 8 a.m., after hours of exploring the depths of the Met, Detective Giorgio went back to the lobby and checked in with the other 2 officers who were still there. He was about to find a phone to call the police station to get more help when a maintenance worker ran inside. And this guy looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Giorgio asked him what was wrong, and the worker said he'd just gone up to the roof of the building to turn on one of the ventilation fans. And while he was up there, he found a pair of women's black shoes, like the ones he'd seen the women in the orchestra wear. Detective Giorgio's heart sank. Helen had disappeared in the middle of a performance, and now her shoes might have been found on the roof. And Giorgio's first thought was that Helen went up there, jumped off the building, taking her own life. Giorgio and the other officers followed the maintenance worker to a service elevator, and they traveled up to the roof in complete silence. The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Giorgio had to squint as the daylight hit his eyes. The maintenance worker stepped out of the elevator and showed the police the pair of black shoes. Then Giorgio walked to the edge of the building and looked down, but there was nothing on the ground that looked out of the ordinary. So the officers spread out and searched the roof for any additional clues. and within a few minutes, Detective Giorgio heard one of them shout, "Oh my God!" Giorgio whipped around and saw an officer standing by this enormous metal fan, looking through the wide space between two of the blades down into the ventilation shaft. Giorgio joined him and leaned over to look into the shaft as well, and he thought he saw something about 30 feet below, but it was a little dark down there, and he couldn't tell what it was. It took a few seconds for Giorgio's eyes to adjust, but slowly, everything came into focus. There at the bottom, he saw the nude, bloody body of a woman. Shortly after, Detective Giorgio looked down the ventilation shaft and saw the woman's body, an NYPD homicide detective named Mike Struck finished his morning run in Central Park and called into the station to check in for the day. Dispatch told him not to even bother coming into the office. Instead, they said, go straight to the Metropolitan Opera House. Struck rushed home, got cleaned up and changed, and then raced down to the Met. The place was now buzzing with employees and police, and amid the crowd, Detective Struck was happy to see Detective Giorgio. The two men enjoyed working together, and they made a good team. Giorgio was calm and almost fatherly, while Struck was blunt and always seemed like he was moving 100 miles an hour. Giorgio filled Struck in on everything police had found that morning. They had found Helen Hagness's body in a large maintenance tunnel on the 3rd floor. It looked like she had fallen to her death through the ventilation shaft from the roof, but Giorgio was sure someone had pushed her, because her hands and feet had been bound with rope and there was a gag stuffed in her mouth. Giorgio thought the attack could have been sexual, but he had no idea if it was random or if somebody had targeted Helen. Then Struck went to go take Polaroids of Helen's body, and he worked with crime scene technicians as they searched for clues. In addition to a pink bra, they found a pair of black pants, a black shirt, and a blue flower, all near the body. Later that day, several hours after the discovery of Helen's body, the NYPD had set up a fully operational command post inside the offices of the Opera House, and teams of detectives, uniformed police, and forensics technicians scoured the building for more evidence. Not long after the command center got set up, Detective Struck left his and Giorgio's makeshift office, walked into the office of one of the Met's operations managers, and asked how many employees the Met had. But when the manager answered more than 800, all Struck could do was laugh. That was an impossible number of people to interview. Still, he asked the manager for a list of all of those employees, as well as a separate list of the people who were actually working or performing at the Opera House when Helen had disappeared from the orchestra pit. When Struck returned to his office, he found a crime scene technician waiting for him. The tech told Struck they were able to lift a pristine palm print off the outside of that ventilation shaft on the roof. In fact, the print was so good, the tech worried that some careless police officer or other investigator had touched the ventilation shaft that morning and made the print. Struck thanked the tech for the update and asked him to report back as soon as he knew anything, even if it was just to say that a cop had messed up and left that print. Then Struck sat down at what was now his desk, he grabbed his phone, and called Helen's husband, Giannis, and told him he needed to come in to the Met. Detectives Struck and Giorgio sat in their office, reviewing their notes while they waited for their first suspect. Forensics officers and the medical examiner had not found any indication of sexual assault, which made them think it was possible that Helen's murder was actually just staged to look like a sexual assault. And they thought maybe Giannis had met with Helen at some point during the intermission. Then they fought, and he took her up to the roof of the building, where he tied her up and killed her. As the two detectives theorized and talked through the case, the door opened and an officer led Giannis in. Giannis actually stumbled into the room and then collapsed into a chair across from the two detectives. Struck and Giorgio could tell Giannis was drunk just from the smell. And even if they couldn't tell from the smell, the open bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand made it pretty clear. This was a new one for both detectives. They had never seen someone show up to a police interview with a bottle of whiskey. But regardless, the detectives jumped right into the questions. They asked Giannis about his and his wife's relationship. Giannis was slurring his words, but he did manage to tell them that he loved his wife, and he had gone to the Met to pick her up and drive her home, but she had never showed up. Struck and Giorgio listened, but they knew that almost nothing Giannis said in his current state would ever hold up in court. I mean, the guy was drunk. So they told him they would have an officer drive him home, and after he'd gotten some rest, they would follow up with him if they needed to. Later that afternoon, Struck and Giorgio were sitting in the theater when the famous Russian dancer Panov and his interpreter walked in. Panov, according to that ballerina that Giorgio had met that morning, may have been the last person who'd seen Helen alive. Panov took a seat near the detectives and asked how he could help. Then, through his interpreter, he said he did know a musician had gone missing at the Met, but he didn't know anything more than that. Giorgio handed Panov a picture of Helen and said she was the missing musician, and the last time anyone had seen her, she was on her way to meet Panov. Panov looked down at the picture and then said something in Russian. The interpreter then told the detectives that Panov did not know this woman, and she never came to visit him that night, and he had no idea she was even planning to. Then Panov spoke for himself. He explained in broken English that at least 50 people came to visit him every night. It was nothing unusual for audience members or other artists to flood his dressing room, and he tried to meet as many people as he could and be as gracious as he could because he knew that a lot of people had helped him become a ballet star. Struck asked him where he was at the time Helen disappeared during the first intermission. Panov said he had rushed to his dressing room to get changed and then went into the audience. He wasn't in the second part of the ballet, but his wife was, and he loved watching her dance. The detectives knew it would be easy to confirm this if it was true. Audience members and the crew would definitely have noticed one of the most famous dancers in the world walking amongst the crowd. So the detectives told both men they could go. Panov said he was sorry about what had happened to the musician, and then he and his interpreter headed backstage. It was late in the day at this point, and everyone working at the Met was getting ready for that evening's performance. So Giorgio and Struck decided to head home and regroup in the morning. The next day, the detectives walked into the Met lobby and greeted the young ballerina who had flagged down Giorgio the day before to say she had ridden on the backstage elevator with Helen. As far as the detectives knew, she may have been the last person to see Helen alive, other than the killer. So they had asked her to come back to see if maybe she could give them a clearer picture of Helen's movements that night. The detectives led the ballerina to their office, and she sat down across from them. She said she was glad they called her because she had remembered something. When she was in the elevator with Helen, there was a man that was there with them. He had told Helen that Panov's dressing room was on the 3rd floor, and this man was still with Helen when the ballerina got off the elevator. Giorgio and Struck leaned forward. This was huge. It meant that that man on the elevator was either the last witness to see Helen alive, or he was the killer. Struck asked the ballerina if she could describe what this man in the elevator looked like. The ballerina squinted her eyes like she was trying to remember, but she shook her head and apologized. She knew he was a man, but that was about it. Detective Giorgio leaned over to Struck and whispered something in his ear, and Struck nodded in agreement. Then Giorgio turned to the ballerina and said he knew this was going to sound strange, but sometimes the police used a hypnotist to help witnesses remember things in more detail. So Giorgio wanted to know if the ballerina would agree to be hypnotized, and the ballerina said yes. So that afternoon, a hypnotist dimmed the lights in the office and then took a seat across from the ballerina. At the same time, Giorgio and Struck lingered in the corner, and an NYPD sketch artist sat a few feet away, holding his pencil and a sketchbook. The hypnotist told the ballerina to close her eyes and listen only to his voice. And slowly, the hypnotist used his soothing voice and his words to draw the ballerina deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation, until finally she was in a trance. Once she was, the hypnotist asked the ballerina to turn back the clock in her mind to the moment that Helen had stepped on the elevator with her. He asked the ballerina to look closely at the elevator and the man who was there, and to describe him as best as she could. The ballerina concentrated, and she began to speak, describing this man. She said he looked like he was between 20 and 25 years old. He was slightly overweight, had a large nose, brown hair, and bright red lips. And as the ballerina gave these details, the sketch artist began to draw. A few minutes later, the hypnotist gently brought the ballerina out of her trance and turned the lights back on. Police quickly made copies of the sketch and circulated it among the Met's employees. And while they were hopeful, there was the reality that a lot of people could fit the description of a young, slightly overweight guy with brown hair. But later that day, a Met employee walked into the detective's office and told them there was someone they needed to talk to right away. It was a stagehand named Vincent Donahue. Struck asked if Vincent fit the description of the man the sketch artist had drawn. The employee said he did, at least a few days ago, but on the night following Helen's murder, Vincent had showed up to work and he had completely shaved off his brown hair and he had a large scratch on his face. That afternoon, Vincent Donahue took a seat inside the detective's office and he looked annoyed. He said he needed this to be fast because he had a lot of work to do before the performance that night. Giorgio smiled and said he understood, but first he said he had to ask where did that nasty scratch on his face come from. Vincent said he and his girlfriend had gotten into a pretty bad fight a couple of nights ago and his girlfriend used her fingernails when she got angry. Detective Struck quickly jumped in and asked why Vincent had shaved his head. Vincent laughed and said during the argument with his girlfriend where she scratched him, she had said the only good thing about him was his hair. So after she had stormed out of the room, he had shaved his hair off just out of spite. Struck had a look on his face like this seemed totally ridiculous, and Vincent could tell. So Vincent quickly said, "Really, this is the truth." Then he told the detectives he didn't have anything to do with that musician getting killed. And he said instead of wasting time talking to him, they needed to talk to a guy named Craig Crimmins. Vincent said Craig was also a stagehand and he had missed a major cue to move scenery during the second act of the performance on the night Helen died. He had just left his backstage post and disappeared. Now, Struck thought Vincent could still be lying. However, the idea that a stagehand went missing around the same time that Helen went missing was suspicious. So Struck told Vincent he could leave and go back to work, but they might need him again. And as soon as Vincent left the office, Struck and Giorgio sent an officer to track down the stagehand, Craig Crimmins. When Craig stepped into Struck and Giorgio's office, he looked exhausted. Giorgio asked Craig to take a seat, and then once he handed him a photo of Helen, and asked Craig if he knew her. Craig glanced at the picture and said he only recognized her from what he had seen in the news. He'd never met her or talked to her. She was a musician, and he didn't really interact with the musicians. Struck just stared at Craig while he spoke. He was young and had brown hair, just like the ballerina's description. So Struck asked if Craig had ridden the backstage elevator at all on the night Helen died. But Craig just shook his head. He said he'd been at his spot backstage the whole performance. Struck leaned across the desk and said if that was true, then why had his colleagues claimed that Craig had been absent from backstage during an important cue that night, specifically during the second act? Craig's face flushed and he stared down at the floor. He said he did miss a cue that night, but he didn't leave backstage. He was embarrassed to admit it to the cops, but he had shown up to work that night drunk and fallen asleep at his post. He told the detectives that another stagehand who worked right beside him backstage had seen him and could back him up that he was telling the truth. Struck and Giorgio questioned Craig a bit longer, and then they let him go. They quickly found the other stagehand Craig had mentioned, and this guy said Craig was telling the truth. He had passed out backstage and basically slept through part of the performance. With Craig's alibi checking out, the detectives still believed they had viable suspects among the other people they had talked to. But they still had hundreds more people to interview, and they still hadn't heard anything about the one major piece of forensic evidence that had been found, the fresh palm print that had been pulled from the ventilation shaft on the roof. So the detectives felt like if they didn't quickly find some new evidence, they were going to be stuck with an overwhelmingly massive suspect pool. 6 days after Helen's murder, on July 29, 1980, her memorial service was held at a New York City church. The church was filled with friends, family, and countless people from the Met. One of Helen's violinist friends performed at the service in her honor. In the 2 weeks following Helen's funeral, Detectives Struck and Giorgio continued their work at the Met, but the Opera House had grown oddly quiet. The ballet had finished its run of performances, and the next show had not opened yet. So the detectives found themselves wandering through the nearly empty, huge building, trying to find anything that they might have missed. But nothing came of those additional searches, and even after weeks of combing through the place, they still felt like there were corners of the Met that remained hidden. But just at the point when the detectives worried their case was about to go cold, Strzok got a call from an excited forensics technician. The tech said he could not believe it, but that nearly perfect palm print found on the ventilation shaft did not belong to a careless police officer or investigator like the forensics team had originally suspected. And it was a relatively fresh print, so it could belong to the killer. When Detective Strzok hung up, he told Giorgio what he just learned, and Giorgio got excited. This palm print was not a smoking gun just yet, but it definitely could be. It was very difficult to access the roof of the Met, so the detectives believed the print had to belong to somebody who worked or performed there, or someone who came by fairly often to visit a family member who worked there. Over the next several days, Opera House employees met with the police in groups of 2s and 3s, and they allowed officers to take their palm prints. And only one of them seemed really nervous about it when asked to give their print. And this was somebody Strzok and Giorgio had already spoken to. This person broke out into a sweat and said that they were uncomfortable with this whole situation. But Detective Giorgio smiled softly, and in his best fatherly voice, he said providing a print was the best way for police to cross them off the list and allow them to put all this behind them. So ultimately, this person agreed and gave their palm print. And when testing on that print came back, Detectives Giorgio and Strzok saw that it was a perfect match to the one found on the roof. And they believed they had found Helen's killer. Based on the palm print, evidence from the scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Hagnes on the night of July 23, 1980. The killer saw Helen walking down a hallway on the 3rd floor during the first intermission of the ballet, and they quickly walked down the hall and grabbed her arm. Helen turned around and didn't understand what was happening, but the killer just pulled out a hammer and pushed her into a stairwell. The killer dragged Helen down all the stairs to one of the sub-basements, and then once there, he demanded she take off her clothes. And Helen did. The killer attempted to rape Helen, but they couldn't. And so out of frustration, they demanded Helen put her clothes back on, and then they grabbed her by the arm, and still with the hammer in hand, they led her all the way upstairs to the roof. Once on the roof, the killer once again made Helen get undressed. Except this time, the killer also bound her wrists and her ankles, and they also gagged her. But Helen fought back. And at some point during the struggle, the killer knew they were running out of time. And so out of frustration and panic and anger and embarrassment, they scooped up Helen and they walked over to the air conditioning vent and they placed her on the ledge. And then, as Helen desperately tried to push past them and get back on the roof, the killer just raised up their leg, placed their foot on her side, and they pushed her into the vent. Helen would fall 6 stories to her death. And after she was dead, the killer reached down, scooped up her clothes, and threw them into the vent after her. After that, the killer ran to the door, believing they had disposed of all the evidence. Except they hadn't. They had accidentally left Helen's shoes up on the roof. The killer flew down the stairs all the way to the theater and ran backstage. However, by the time they got there, they were out of time. The intermission was over and the ballet had started again, meaning the killer had missed a very important cue. Craig Crimmins, the stagehand who claimed to have shown up drunk and fallen asleep backstage, killed Helen Hagnes. On the night of the murder, Craig was in fact the man on the elevator with Helen and the young ballerina. And when Helen asked about where Panov's dressing room was, Craig had chimed in and said it was on the 3rd floor. But that was a lie. He was simply trying to trap her. And so when Helen got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, Craig followed her down the hallway, grabbed her, and brought her to the basement, intending to rape her. However, he could not perform sexually, and so in his rage and humiliation, he dragged her up to the roof where he would kill her. Craig did resemble the sketch from the ballerina's hypnosis session. However, it was Craig's palm print on the air conditioning vent that made detectives turn their focus on him. And soon after the detectives discovered Craig's print matched the one on the ventilation shaft, they learned that the other stagehand who said he saw Craig sleeping backstage was lying for his coworker. But he thought Craig had asked him to lie for him just to cover up the fact that he had left backstage and missed an important cue. Craig Crimmins was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He went on to serve 40 years in prison and was paroled in August of 2021. At about 2:30 a.m. on August 27, 2010, a 29-year-old man named Christopher Kaiser and his girlfriend Emily held hands and stepped out onto a railroad bridge high above the ground in a remote area of North Carolina. It was totally dark out except for the beams of their flashlights. Christopher and Emily were only 15 minutes away from the big event that they had come out here to witness, and they were nervous and excited. They checked the time, then started walking slowly across the bridge, pausing every few feet to listen for the sound of a train rumbling toward them. But all they could hear was whispering and giggling and the occasional shout coming from the 10 other people who had all hiked out here as well to wait alongside them, and who were now just standing in clusters all along the bridge. So usually, this railroad bridge, which was called the Boston Bridge, was not a place that people went to. First of all, it was technically trespassing to be there, but beyond that, the bridge was way out in the woods and required a rocky hike to get to. And once you did get to it, there really wasn't much to see. The bridge itself was pretty basic as bridges go. It had been built in the 1850s out of brick and stone, with big arches underneath, and it crossed a ravine that was about 100 feet deep. Train tracks ran the entire length of the bridge, which was about 300 feet. On either end, the tracks disappeared into the forest. And so the Boston Bridge was just a kind of boring, typical railroad bridge with no people on it, except one night a year. And that night was tonight, because tonight the Boston Bridge was supposed to be haunted. Exactly 119 years earlier, on August 27, 1891, a passenger train had somehow lost control while crossing this bridge, and it careened off the side, plunging into the ravine below. The accident had killed 23 people. Now, Christopher and Emily knew that regular trains had not used this bridge in a long time. But ever since the accident, legend had it that if you went to the bridge on the anniversary of that crash, at the exact moment the train went off the side, apparently a ghost train would appear, speeding along the tracks and blasting its horn. People said you could actually hear the horrible screeching sound of the brakes as they tried and failed to keep the train on the tracks, and then you could hear the screaming of the passengers as they plunged to their deaths all over again. This ghost train passing through was the big event that Christopher and Emily and everybody else had come out to see. Tonight, they were all ghost hunters. Just then, one of the people at the bridge checked the time and called out that there was only 1 minute left to go till the ghost train arrived. And with this, all the whispering and laughing and yelling stopped. Everyone on the bridge fell silent and waited. Out on the tracks, Christopher and Emily looked at each other and squeezed each other's hands. The couple was deeply in love and considered each other soulmates. And one of the best things about their relationship was the sense of adventure they both shared. And tonight was exactly the kind of adrenaline-pumping thing they both loved doing together. And so as the clock ticked down, the couple turned to watch the tracks where they emerged from the woods in the direction they knew the ghost train was supposed to come from. And as they did this, they actually began to feel the bridge tremble under their feet. And at the same time, they heard a few people start shouting with excitement. It was really happening. From the woods came a low rumbling sound that quickly turned into a roar. And for a second, Christopher and Emily couldn't believe it. Of course, they wanted to see the ghost train. That's why they were there. But they hadn't truly been convinced this ghost train was actually real. But now, as they watched, a bright light emerged from the woods and flooded the bridge. The ghost train was almost right on top of them. Suddenly, the train blasted its horn, and then Christopher and Emily heard the screeching of the brakes, just like the legend said they would. But this was not fun and spooky. This was actually terrifying. The other ghost hunters on the bridge started screaming and running, and so did Christopher and Emily. But suddenly, Christopher just stopped running and turned to Emily, and he looked her in the eyes and told her, "I love you." And then Christopher pushed Emily off the bridge. Not long afterwards, police and paramedics flooded the woods around Bastion Bridge and the ravine beneath it. A helicopter circled overhead, shining a bright light down to help them search. And it didn't take long before one of the policemen working his way down the slope that led to the ravine stopped cold and called out for help. He had found Emily. She was badly injured and barely able to move, but she was alive. The police officer looked up at the bridge over his head. He figured she must have fallen 30 feet or so. It was incredible that she had not died. As paramedics strapped Emily into a neck brace to get her safely on a stretcher, another police officer down in the bottom of the ravine shouted that he needed backup now. That officer had found Christopher. It would take some time, but the first responders would eventually piece together what had happened on the Bastion Bridge in the early hours of August 27, 2010. At around 2:45 a.m., members of the ghost hunting group waiting on the bridge had begun to cheer. They saw a bright light approaching the bridge, and they knew this meant the ghost train had arrived. But just seconds later, those cheers turned into screams. Christopher saw everybody else scattering to get away from the bridge, and suddenly he knew exactly what was happening. Passenger trains hadn't used these tracks in decades, but freight trains still did. And by some bizarre chance, one of those freight trains came barreling onto the bridge at the exact time when everybody thought the ghost train would appear. On that freight train, the conductor frantically blew the horn and tried to bring the train to a stop. But Christopher could tell the train was going too fast, and there was no way it could stop in time. And so Christopher and Emily, they started running away from the train down the bridge like the others were, but Christopher saw Emily was lagging behind. And Christopher knew he might be able to outrun this train and get off in time, but from the looks of it, Emily, the love of his life, was not going to be able to do that. And so Christopher made a terrible decision. He took a quick look down to make sure his desperate plan made sense. Then he stopped running, waiting for Emily to catch up with him. He looked her in the eyes, told her he loved her, and then he pushed her off the bridge. Christopher could see that where they were standing was only about 30 feet above the ravine, not 100. And so he figured by pushing her off the bridge, she had a better chance of surviving a 30-foot fall than of being hit by a speeding freight train. However, what Christopher must have understood was that by waiting for Emily and pushing her off to try to save her life, it would not leave him enough time to save his own life. And he was right. Almost instantly after he saved his girlfriend's life, the freight train struck him and threw him off the bridge. When the police officer found Christopher a short while later, he was already deceased. As for Emily, she was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and she eventually recovered from her injuries. And so Christopher is remembered as a hero. One night in the early 1940s, in a small town in eastern Kentucky, a highly respected local man named Arthur Lewis silently made his way down a dark road. Everybody who knew Arthur, and that was most people in this small town, knew him as an upstanding, law-abiding citizen. But tonight, Arthur clutched a hammer and a chisel in his hands and crept as slowly and quietly as he could because he didn't want anybody to know what he was doing. The moon and stars cast an eerie glow across the town. Arthur was not a superstitious person. In fact, he was pretty much the opposite. But the way the moonlight hit the trees along the road made it look like something was moving in the shadows, and Arthur couldn't help but feel creeped out. Still, the moon and stars provided the perfect amount of light for Arthur to see where he was going without being seen. So he took a breath, collected himself, and moved quickly through the shadows on the road. After walking for a few minutes, he turned onto another dirt road that led to the top of a small hill that was ringed by trees. There were a few old wooden houses along this dirt road, and Arthur saw lights on inside a couple of them. So he crouched down a little bit more to try to hide himself in the dark and picked up his pace. Arthur stopped when he reached the top of the hill. A wrought iron gate and fence stood in his path, and there was a thick metal chain with a lock on it wrapped around the gate. Arthur scanned the darkness all around him and took another steadying breath. He knew everybody in town would think what he was about to do was crazy, because this land belonged to a man named Carl Puit, and Carl Puit was dangerous. But tonight, Arthur didn't care. He was on a mission. Arthur pulled on the gate, but the chain and lock kept it closed tight. So he walked a couple of feet away from the gate and just tossed his hammer and chisel over the fence, which was only a few feet tall. And so Arthur grabbed on to the thin wrought iron bars that made up this fence, and very carefully he climbed up and leapt over to the other side. When he landed, he scooped up his hammer and chisel and walked through some overgrown grass. Now, despite having the hammer and chisel, Arthur did not come to this place in order to work. Instead, he came here to vandalize the place. He had come here really to prove a point. He wanted to show the people in town that Carl Puit was not as powerful as they all thought, and they didn't have to live in fear of him any longer. Just then, Arthur spotted the engraved stone marker he was looking for, a marker that declared in capital letters that this patch of land was Carl's. So he gripped his chisel tightly and walked towards the marker. But just as he drew close to the marker and raised his tools to strike, Arthur suddenly froze. He couldn't tell if the moon and stars were playing tricks on him, but it looked like a shadow of a large chain had appeared on the ground in front of him. Arthur instinctively turned around, but he saw he was way too far away from the gate for the chain on it to be casting a shadow all the way over here. However, when Arthur turned back around, the shadow of the chain was now gone. Arthur was shaken up, but he kind of laughed at himself and shook it off. Things always seemed to look strange in the dark. And so Arthur placed the metal blade of the chisel directly on the stone marker and then slammed the hammer into the back of the chisel. A piece of the stone flew off and fell to the ground, and right away Arthur forgot all about that weird shadow he'd just seen. And instead, he just continued chipping away as fast as he could. He knew the noise he was making could attract attention from the people who lived nearby, and he had no intention of getting caught tonight. But just then, Arthur heard a sound over all the noise he was making, and it sounded like footsteps, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Arthur stopped hammering and crouched down a few feet away from the stone marker, trying his best to hide. But as Arthur looked around in the darkness, he didn't see anyone. And eventually, the footstep sounds disappeared, at which point Arthur told himself it must have just been the wind blowing through the trees or something, and a bit apprehensively, he got back to work with his hammer and chisel. But suddenly, the sound of the footsteps came back, and this time they were so much louder, and they seemed much closer. Whoever it was, they were clearly making their way towards Arthur. And so Arthur had no idea if it was someone from one of the nearby houses, or if a local cop had shown up or something, but either way, he wasn't sticking around to find out. And so he turned around to make a run for it when he froze, because something was standing right in front of him, blocking his way. Arthur began to shake with fear, and then without thinking, he dropped the hammer and chisel and took off running. Minutes later, in a house located about halfway down the road from where Arthur was, a man was sitting in his front room when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the top of the nearby hill that belonged to Carl Puit. The man just froze for a second. The sound frightened him, but it also confused him, because people just did not go up to the top of that hill anymore. But in the eerie silence that followed that scream, this man sort of snapped out of his confusion and shouted for his wife to stay inside, and then he ran to the kitchen and found his flashlight. The man stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and ran to the dirt road that led up to the top of the hill. And as he did, he saw a beam from another flashlight a couple yards ahead of him. He quickly recognized that it was his neighbor, so he called out to him. The neighbor turned around and walked a few steps back down the road, and the two men quickly exchanged notes about the scream they had heard. And then, together, they rushed towards the top of the hill. Once they got there, they arrived in front of the wrought iron gate, and when they shined their flashlights through it onto the ground, they saw something lying just on the other side of the gate. They both just stared at the ground for a few seconds in silence, transfixed by how gruesome the scene was. Finally, one of the two men said he'd go get help, and then he turned and ran back down the hill and headed straight into town. A little later that night, the man who had gone to get help returned to the top of the hill to the gate, now with a police officer. The neighbor who'd been there before hadn't moved. All three men lifted their flashlights and shined them on the ground just beyond the gate. And together, they all stared at the dead body of Arthur Lewis. The metal chain that had been used to keep the gate locked had been removed and was wrapped around Arthur's neck, and Arthur's face had turned a sickly bluish gray. The three men looked up from the body, and they all just nodded to each other. In most circumstances, the discovery of a dead body like this would cause shock and alarm. But these three men felt nothing but resignation and sorrow. They weren't surprised, panicked, or afraid, because they already knew exactly what had happened. Everybody in town knew the kind of violence Carl Puit was capable of. This is why most people in town would never have set foot on the piece of land where Arthur had gone, and why they would definitely never have vandalized something that belonged to Carl. And this was because of the horrific chain of events that began back in 1938, a few years before Arthur made his fateful trip up the hill. Back in 1938, late one afternoon, Carl Puit had finished a hard day's work in town as a carpenter and headed home. Like most people in this small town, Carl knew pretty much everybody and seemed to get along well with his friends and neighbors. Most days, he worked hard building and repairing things for other people, and then when he got home, he would often find his wife cooking dinner for both of them. But today, when Carl arrived home, he didn't smell anything cooking, and he didn't see his wife in the kitchen. Instead, he heard a strange noise coming from his bedroom at the back of the house. He ran there to make sure his wife was okay, but when he stepped into the room, he found his wife in bed with another man. Carl began to scream, and the other man leapt out of the bed, climbed through the window, and fled across town. As for Carl's wife, she just stayed in the bed, covering herself with a blanket and trying to apologize to her husband and trying to get him to calm down. But Carl, filled with rage, grabbed a metal chain he used on his job, leapt on top of his wife, wrapped the chain around her throat, and strangled her to death. After the murder of his wife, no one in town ever heard from Carl again. Even though there had never been an arrest or trial, the townspeople were glad Carl was gone. They tried to quickly put this horrific event behind them and basically stopped thinking about Carl Puit. However, within months of this murder, a series of violent deaths began taking place in town, and most people did not think these deaths were accidents. The first death that caught people's attention involved a young man who had been seen happily riding his bicycle towards the dirt road that led to the top of the hill. But later that day, someone found the boy back in town lying dead on the street, strangled with his own bike chain. Days later, after the boy had been buried, neighbors found his mother dead in her own yard. She also had been strangled, but with a clothesline, while she was out hanging up laundry. These two deaths put the whole town on edge. Even though nobody had seen him, many people suspected that Carl Puit must have come back because the boy and his mother had been strangled to death, just like Carl's wife had been. And not long after that, a farmer turned up, strangled with the reins from his own horse-drawn wagon, which prompted a police investigation. However, before he could finish it, that police officer was strangled to death as well, found in an open field with a large chain wrapped around his neck, looking like it had almost decapitated him. After the death of this police officer, combined with all the other strange strangulation deaths, the town had had it, they were terrified, and they went into full panic mode. Soon, stories began to surface that people had seen Carl wandering through the shadows on this small patch of land he owned on the top of the hill, just waiting for his next victim. And now, Carl appeared to have found his next victim. Arthur Lewis, the man who said he wasn't afraid of Carl, who had traveled up the hill with his hammer and chisel. On top of the hill, the officer and the two men who'd found Arthur's body stood at the gate. The officer told the men to step back and wait over there. Once they had, he opened the gate, walked through, and stepped directly over Arthur's body. He made his way through the grass and found Arthur's hammer and chisel on the ground. And right next to them was the engraved marker that Arthur had come out to deface. However, when the officer shined his light on the marker had no damage to it whatsoever. It was completely intact. Not a single piece of the stone had been chipped off by the chisel. The officer crouched down and moved his light over the stone. And he saw very clearly that on this stone were the words Carl Puit. And next to it were dates. The date Carl was born and the date Carl died. Because this stone marker that Arthur had come up here to deface was actually Carl's gravestone. Because Carl had died back in 1938 on the day he found his wife in bed with another man. It would turn out Carl Puit not only killed his own wife, but also after seeing what he had done, seeing her dead body, he grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired, taking his own life. Soon after the murder-suicide, Carl's wife was laid to rest in the cemetery near her church, but her family demanded that Carl be buried somewhere else. And so Carl was buried in an isolated grave in an old cemetery at the top of that hill. And of course, since the man was dead, everybody in town assumed he was gone for good, and they would never have to deal with Carl again. But that all changed not long after Carl was buried, when people in town reported seeing strange shadows around his gravesite. And these shadows always took on the same form: a large chain like the one Carl had used to murder his wife. The story spread, and soon a morbid curiosity about Carl's grave arose in town. And that's around the same time that the other strangling deaths began, and when people started to claim that maybe Carl's ghost was responsible for them. But being strangled was not the only thing that connected all these victims. It would turn out, not long before their deaths, they had all tried to vandalize Carl Puit's grave. Some had done it on a dare, others did it out of anger. As for the police officer who eventually launched this investigation following all these strangling deaths, well, he didn't vandalize Carl Puit's grave, but he was so intrigued by the idea that Carl's ghost could be responsible that he went to the gravesite and began taking photographs. And it was not long after that he died. As for Arthur, he did attempt to vandalize the grave, but he was not doing it out of anger or some vendetta against Carl or a dare. He was actually doing it to prove to the rest of the townspeople that there was no such thing as ghosts, and that Carl Puit was dead and could no longer hurt anyone. However, the instant Arthur began to deface that headstone, someone or something strangled him to death, and many people believe it was Carl Puit's ghost. And despite all those attempts at defacing Carl Puit's headstone, that headstone was always found, at least according to local legend, in perfect condition. Following the discovery of Arthur's body, people in town really began to fear Carl Puit's ghost and his cursed headstone, and they demanded that the cemetery on the hill be closed. And so family members with loved ones buried up there had their bodies removed and reburied in other cemeteries. However, nobody dared touch Carl's grave. So Carl's body remained in that cemetery until 1958, so 20 years after he had killed his wife and taken his own life. At that time, in 1958, a strip mining company dug up the ground on the hill, destroying Carl's body and his headstone, and so the curse was said to have finally been lifted. And so, if these two stories tell us anything, it's that if you think you can go searching for ghosts without consequences, you can't. On Sunday, September 9th, 1984, Dave and Sandy Lutkins sat down for lunch with some friends at a pizza place in the small, tight-knit community of The Dalles, Oregon. Dave looked around at the bustling restaurant, and then he looked over at his wife and smiled. They owned the place. It was a franchise of the Shakey's Pizza Parlor chain, and he and his wife were clearly thrilled to see so many people stopping by to eat after Sunday church services. Business was actually going so well that Dave and Sandy were thinking about opening up another location in nearby Hood River. But it was Dave's day off today, and he didn't want to think about work. Between raising kids and running the restaurant, he didn't get much time to just hang out and catch up with friends. And so Dave turned back to the two friends at the table with he and his wife, and they were a married couple named Dan and Kay, and Dave asked them, how are things going? Now, Dave knew that Dan was very active in local politics, and therefore kind of knew all the latest town gossip. And so really that's what Dave was asking Dan, like, hey, what's going on in town? What have you heard? And so after asking this question, Dave began to eat his macaroni salad, as Dan very enthusiastically began to fill them in on what was happening behind the scenes in the Dalles. There was a debate about tearing down an old school that they had attended as kids, and there were also some plans to renovate a nearby park, but the big news was local officials were still clashing with a religious commune that had recently bought a ranch on the outskirts of town. And the people in this town were complaining that some of these commune members dressed very funny and they smelled weird, like they could be homeless or something. And worse yet, according to the townspeople, this commune had apparently bussed in actual homeless people from around the country and then registered them to vote. And so as Dan was talking about this, he couldn't help himself and just shook his head and said, what would happen if these weirdos from the commune took over? As Dave listened, he thought about his own experience with this commune. He actually didn't have any complaints about them. In fact, sometimes a few of them would venture into town and come to Shakey's to eat, which was great for Dave and Sandy, and they never caused any problems, and they always paid for their food, so really Dave had no complaints. And so Dan continued chatting for a bit longer about the commune and about some other topics around town, and then eventually they all finished eating their lunch, and they stood up and said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. Later that day, Dave was standing behind the cash register inside of their restaurant, counting out the day's profits. And as he did that, suddenly a cramp stabbed at his stomach so hard that he had to bend over. He tried to breathe through the spasm, but it only seemed to get worse, and then also he was hit with a wave of nausea. Dave knew Sandy was outside in the car waiting for him, and so he pushed through the pain and finished at the register, and then he went to the doors, walked outside, locked up behind him, and made his way over to the car. Once he was inside, he told Sandy about this pain he had, and he told her he felt nauseous, and he said, I just gotta get home. And so Dave drove as fast as he could back to their house, trying to keep the nausea at bay, and as soon as they pulled into the driveway, Dave hopped out, ran inside the house, ran into the bathroom, locked it behind him, and then he just began vomiting practically nonstop into the toilet. A minute later, Dave heard Sandy knocking furiously at the door, and Dave grabbed onto the bathroom sink to kind of pull himself back to his feet, and he reached over and unlocked the door. Dave thought his wife was knocking because she was worried about him, but no, as soon as the door opened, she just rushed past Dave and took his spot at the toilet and began retching into the bowl too. Dave figured they must have caught some sort of stomach bug and just needed to rest. But when he tried to walk to their bedroom, he became so dizzy he almost fell over. So he just sat on the ground waiting for his wife to finish in the bathroom. And as he waited, Dave put a hand to his forehead and felt how hot he was getting. His body became slick with sweat as chills ran down his body, and his stomach began to cramp up again very painfully. And then when Sandy finally emerged, Dave felt nauseous again, and so he rushed back inside and began vomiting. And then every time he was done vomiting, he would have these horrible bouts of diarrhea. And so when Dave came out of the bathroom the second time, he found Sandy lying on the bed. She was pale and there was sweat running down her face, and she started saying something to him, but when she spoke, her words were slurred and unsteady. At this point, Dave was really beginning to worry. It seemed like they both might not just have a stomach bug, that this might be something kind of serious and they might need medical attention. But at the same time, Dave wasn't sure he could even drive them to the hospital with how he was feeling. And so Dave just climbed onto the bed next to his wife, and the two of them just laid there for several hours, hoping that whatever was going on with them might begin to taper off. But after several hours, Dave was still feeling incredibly weak and horrible. And so at this point, Dave decided they couldn't wait any longer to get help. He knew that he and Sandy were now so dehydrated that he was worried they could pass out or something. So Dave got out of the bed and stumbled to the kitchen and called a taxi. 10 minutes later, he and Sandy were in that taxi on the way to the emergency room. After a short ride, Dave walked inside of the emergency department with Sandy leaning on his arm for support. To Dave's surprise, the waiting room was already completely packed, and right away he spotted a few people who had eaten at his restaurant earlier that day, and all of them looked pale and sweaty just like he and his wife. Dave and Sandy limped over to the check-in counter and nearly bumped into their friend, Dan, who looked even worse than Dave and Sandy. The trio sat together as they waited, but nobody said anything. They all felt too sick to talk. Eventually, Dave and Sandy were admitted to the hospital, and a nurse hooked them up to IV drips to replenish all the fluids they'd lost. Then, the doctor explained that the couple was too sick to go home, and they would need to stay overnight for observation, or at least until they figured out what was making them so sick. And so after Dave and Sandy were set up in their room, a doctor said a nurse would come by soon to collect blood and stool samples shortly. The next morning, the doctor returned to Dave and Sandy's hospital room and told them he had their test results. Dave listened intently as she explained that he and Sandy had Salmonella poisoning, a bacterial infection that attacks the intestinal tract. And in fact, the doctor said the majority of the other people who had come in the previous day, along with Dave and Sandy, they also had Salmonella poisoning. Now, the doctor said they didn't know where the Salmonella had come from, but immediately Dave had a bad feeling. He didn't dare say it out loud, not even to Sandy, but secretly, he worried the Salmonella poisoning had come from their restaurant. Dave grappled with that horrible thought as he and Sandy were discharged and began to make their way back through the hospital towards the exit. And as they got near the exit, they saw there was still a crowd of patients waiting to be seen, which actually made the waiting room seem even busier than it had been the night before. Dave guided Sandy to the door, feeling very grateful to be getting out of the hospital, but also feeling very guilty that his restaurant might very well be to blame for this outbreak. Later that day, Oregon State Epidemiologist Dr. Lawrence Foster picked up the ringing phone on his desk. An epidemiologist is someone who investigates patterns and causes of disease and injury. Dr. Foster was a quiet man with a gentle demeanor who operated extremely well under pressure, responding to emergencies with science and logic. He actually loved the intense work of being an epidemiologist and listened closely as an official on the phone outlined a new breaking case. In the past 24 hours, nearly 20 patients had arrived all at once at a small hospital near the Dalles, Oregon. All of them had been diagnosed with Salmonella poisoning, and almost all of them had eaten at a local pizza place right before getting Salmonella poisoning. Dr. Foster thanked the official for calling with the update and said he would get right on it. After hanging up the phone, Dr. Foster did not think this was some crazy crisis. Instead, he thought this was a pretty straightforward case of food poisoning, and so now his job was to locate the source of the Salmonella bacteria and eliminate it. So he grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. He knew where to start looking. About an hour later, Dr. Foster pulled up to Shakey's Pizza Parlor in the Dalles. It looked like an old-school pizza joint with a large hand-painted sign and Adirondack chairs out front. The restaurant was closed for the day, but the doctor had picked up the keys from Dave Lutkins, one of the owners, on the way over. After opening the door, Dr. Foster stepped inside and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The first step to pinpointing the exact source of the Salmonella outbreak was to gather food samples and then take them back to the lab to be tested. And so that's what Dr. Foster was here to do, get those samples. And then while the food testing was underway, members of Dr. Foster's team would interview the restaurant's employees, while others would talk to the patients at the hospital who had fallen ill. And so Dr. Foster began walking around the empty restaurant, stopping periodically to look closer at table surfaces and kitchen equipment and whatever else he could see. And then eventually he walked over to the large walk-in refrigerator. And when he poked his head inside, he saw there were rows of plastic containers holding the restaurant's salad bar offerings. Fresh veggies, several kinds of lettuce, garnishes, and dressings. And right away, Dr. Foster felt like this very likely could be where the Salmonella came from. He knew from experience that the raw ingredients on an open-air salad bar were a very common source of food poisoning. And so Dr. Foster worked his way through the walk-in fridge, carefully plucking out samples of each food item using sanitized tweezers and placing them all in the small plastic containers that he'd brought along. By the time he left the restaurant, Dr. Foster was certain the samples he had taken would crack the case in no time. Later that week, Dave Lutkin sat in a corner booth at Shakey's, dejectedly staring out the window. He and Sandy had been sick for days, but he was feeling better and the delirium had finally gone away. However, coming back to his senses was no picnic. Even though he had deep cleaned and reopened his restaurant and had shut down his salad bar just in case, word was all over the news that their restaurant, Shakey's, had very likely caused the big Salmonella outbreak. And so as a result, Dave and his wife had not seen a single customer all day, or all week for that matter. Dave let out a sigh as he thought about all the money they were losing, but even worse than that, 13 of his employees were still sick, and dozens of his regular customers had fallen ill and were still dealing with symptoms. Suddenly, the ring of a telephone pulled Dave away from his negative spiraling thoughts, and so he rushed to the counter, hopeful whoever was calling was a customer, maybe looking to place a takeout order. And so he brought the receiver to his ear, and the second it was against his ear, he quickly had to pull it away, because on the other line was a man who'd gotten sick after eating at Shakey's, and he was screaming at Dave through the phone, threatening to sue him. And so Dave just sat there listening as this guy accused him of feeding his customers dirty produce. Dave had gotten dozens of calls just like that one, and he was starting to worry that they would never end. Once the yelling man had said his piece and hung up, Dave walked back to the booth, shoulders slumped. Then he turned back to the window and went back to scanning the streets for customers he knew would never come. A week later, Dr. Foster sat in his office with his head in his hands. He'd been so sure that this outbreak of food poisoning was due to contaminated ingredients at Shakey's Pizza that he really hadn't even considered if that wasn't it. It just seemed so likely. But now he knew he was incorrect. That had not been the source, because he'd just gotten word that there were an additional 20 cases of salmonella poisoning from people who ate at 2 other restaurants in town. So Shakey's could not be the only source of the bacteria that was making these people sick. Dr. Foster was confident in his abilities, but he also knew when to admit that he had been wrong. And he definitely underestimated the severity of this salmonella outbreak. It was way bigger than just Shakey's. In fact, he was receiving daily calls from the Dow's emergency room begging him for updates as the number of salmonella cases surged towards 100. And so far, Dr. Foster didn't have any answers. And so he stood up from his chair and began pacing around his office. He couldn't just sit around and wait all day. With all the new cases popping up, maybe his team just needed to expand their investigation. 30 minutes later, Dr. Foster, along with his team, sat around a large table in the conference room. He did his best to stay calm and collected, but truthfully, he was starting to feel nervous. He told his team that all they knew for sure right now was that all these people who got sick had gotten sick after eating at 3 different restaurants, all in the Dow's. And then after saying that, he opened up the floor to discussion. He basically wanted people to come up with more ideas about where the salmonella outbreak could be coming from. And so after going back and forth for a few minutes, kind of rehashing the same details everybody knew, one scientist who'd been quiet during the entire discussion so far suddenly spoke up. He wondered if maybe the salmonella could have somehow entered the town's water supply. If the bacteria was in the water supply, then it kind of made sense that it was now being found in multiple locations. Dr. Foster considered the alarming implications of this possibility. If the salmonella was coming from the water supply, there was no telling how much bigger this outbreak would get. Dr. Foster told the scientists to gather his things. They were going to go to the Dow's to check their water. The next day, Dr. Michael Skeels leaned over a lab bench in his laboratory at the Oregon State Public Health Lab near Portland. Like his colleague, Dr. Foster, Dr. Skeels had been working around the clock to try to figure out the source of the Salmonella outbreak in the Dales, examining dozens of samples every day. Dr. Skeels adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses on the bridge of his nose, willing his tired eyes to stay open as he screened yet another petri dish with bacteria grown from a lettuce sample. Unsurprisingly, it seemed to be teeming with Salmonella bacteria. But there was something odd about all the bacteria they kept finding. There were 2,500 different strains of Salmonella that Dr. Skeels knew of, but they kept finding the exact same very rare strain over and over again. Dr. Skeels reasoned that this meant that all of the Salmonella had almost certainly come from one source, but he had no idea what the source could be. Dr. Skeels knew one thing for sure, though. It was not the water supply. His staff had tested the public water samples Dr. Foster's team had collected, and they had found no bacteria in the water. It was totally clean. So the investigation was sort of back to square one. Dr. Skeels sighed as he lifted his head from the lab bench and looked around the room at his exhausted colleagues hunched over their work. He desperately needed more coffee, or even better, a nap. But that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Because not only was their investigation stalled, the public health crisis in the Dalles was only getting worse. Over the past few days, the number of restaurants involved in Salmonella poisonings had increased. Salmonella had now been found in 10 restaurants. And so now a second wave of infections was engulfing the town, and this time it was much bigger than the first. Dozens more people were sick, and more people were arriving at the hospital every hour. The scale of this second outbreak was overwhelming the town. Emergency rooms were struggling to manage the new patients, and all of the hospital beds were full, and patients were sleeping in the hallways. And so, of course, the people who were getting sick were lashing out at the only people they could, the doctors and nurses, who were doing their best, but they were having a really hard time keeping up. It was just complete chaos. Dr. Skeels was struggling to keep up too. He was doing his best to manage all of the lab testing while also trying to figure out why this new outbreak was happening. It seemed like the Salmonella was showing up everywhere and yet still coming from nowhere. The bacteria kept being found where they expected it to be, mostly in salad bar vegetables like lettuce and cucumbers, but also they found it in items that are rarely contaminated with Salmonella, such as salad dressings and coffee creamers. And they still had no idea how so many different foods could be contaminated. It wasn't the water supply, so where was this bacteria coming from? Dr. Skeels waved his tired staff over to him in the middle of the lab. And as they walked over, he took in their bloodshot eyes and their stained lab coats, and he knew he looked just as bad as they did. Dr. Skeels took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes. He told the group that the outbreak was getting way too big for this small staff. If they were going to find the source of this mass poisoning and prevent new cases, they needed help. It was now time for the federal government to step in, which meant they needed to contact the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short. His very tired team nodded in agreement, and so Dr. Skeels turned and headed to his office to make the call. A few days later, Dr. Skeels could barely contain his shock as he combed through the CDC's research. The CDC had put its enormous resources to good use, interviewing hundreds of patients as well as their families and friends. They spoke to 325 food handlers who had all worked at the 10 restaurants. They measured salad bar temperatures and investigated food handling practices. They even visited a few farms to inspect the milk and vegetables that these restaurants had used. And they discovered that people who had food that was delivered from these 10 restaurants did not get sick, but the people who actually physically ate inside of those 10 restaurants did get sick. They also discovered that while the blue cheese salad dressing at one of these salad bars was teeming with Salmonella, well, the powdered mix that makes that salad dressing contained no Salmonella. To Dr. Skeels, these were very revealing discoveries, because it meant that the food in these 10 restaurants was safe when it left the kitchen, like for a takeout order, but then somehow, once it was in the dining areas inside of these restaurants, it became contaminated. But it was hard for Dr. Skeels to even come up with an idea of how that could happen. He wondered, for example, how the powdered salad dressing mix could be clean while it was in storage and then suddenly turn poisonous when the staff prepared it for the salad bar. It just didn't make sense. But then Dr. Skeels had an alarming thought. What if someone was putting the salmonella in the dressing after it was prepared? Or putting the salmonella in the food once it was inside of the dining hall? I mean, if this was done by a person, then it all made sense. Dr. Skills realized that he was imagining a possibility that seemed too far-fetched to be true. Did someone purposely grow toxic bacteria and then for some reason choose to release it into the community? The name for that was bioterrorism, but the question was, if it really was bioterrorism, which again was very far-fetched, who would want to do that? About a week later, Dr. Skills sat in the conference room at the Oregon State Public Health Department, along with some of his senior scientists, to hear the latest update from the CDC officials. One of the CDC representatives began with the good news. The salmonella outbreak had finally died down sort of on its own. Thankfully, no one had died, and there hadn't been any new cases for a week. But then Dr. Skills heard the bad news. They still did not know what, or who, had caused the 2 waves of salmonella cases that sickened an incredible 700 people. But the more they'd learned about these outbreaks, the more everyone seemed to agree with Dr. Skills. The whole fiasco did seem like a deliberate attack. They just couldn't prove it. The CDC said they were going to continue their investigation, but it seemed like for now, the crisis was over. Dr. Skills was relieved to return to his usual work, but he felt haunted by the fact that he hadn't solved this mystery. A year later, on October 2nd, 1985, Dr. Skills pulled his car to the side of a country road outside of the Dalles. His team was already there waiting for him. As he approached the group, Dr. Skills felt the nerves and anticipation bubbling up all around him. But public health officials were not the only ones on the side of this lonely road. They were surrounded by federal agents carrying semi-automatic weapons and wearing bulletproof vests. This was a raid by federal agents, and Dr. Skills felt very out of place. Now, this job, being a part of this raid, could not be more different than Dr. Skills' usual stream of research and meetings, but he reminded himself that they needed him. If this raid was going to be a success, he needed to stay calm and focused and do his job. And so the leadership in charge of the raid finished running through the plan a few more times, and then everybody returned to their respective vehicles. Dr. Skills drove behind the rest of the 50-person group as they entered through the gates of the 64,000-acre ranch that was the home of the Rajneeshi religious commune. Dr. Skills headed straight for one unassuming building, search warrant in hand. He was accompanied by a germ warfare expert from Washington, D.C. The instant they stepped inside of that building, Dr. Skills could not believe what he saw. It was a state-of-the-art medical laboratory that this commune was clearly running. Dr. Skills walked around inspecting the various experiments and documents that were strewn about. At some point, he found a copy of the anarchist cookbook open to a certain page just laying out on the table. A chill ran down the doctor's spine as he flipped through the instructions on how to make homemade explosives and illegal drugs. Nearby, there was another book that focused on military biological warfare. The literature was fascinating and horrifying, but it was not what he was looking for. Dr. Skills continued walking through the lab, making his way to a back corner where he found a large walk-in freezer. His eyes went wide as he took in the rows of rare chemicals and bacteria perched along the walls inside of glass vials. He walked to the back of the freezer and he leaned in close to see the contents, and his breath caught in his throat as he read the label closest to him. It said, Salmonella. Dr. Skills carefully removed the glass vials and placed them in his bag for evidence. The answer to the poisoning of an entire town was right in front of him. Lab tests would prove that the salmonella samples Dr. Skills collected inside of that lab were an exact match for the strain that was found in the Dalles a year earlier. The Rajneeshis had deliberately planted the salmonella at Shakey's Pizza Parlor and other restaurants in town, hoping to sicken as many people as possible. The Rajneeshis preached that they were leading the way to a new era of free love at their commune. However, they kept on getting into fights with the Wasco County Commission that regulated what they could and could not do at their commune. So the Rajneeshis had decided to just go ahead and take over the commission by installing their own candidates. The Rajneeshi leaders reasoned that if most local residents were too sick to vote, then their candidates could easily win. They used the months before the November vote for a bizarre kind of dress rehearsal. Initially, commune members had put salmonella in spray bottles and doused doors and other public places in the Dalles, but no one had gotten sick. So, in early September, they tried spraying salad bars in 10 local restaurants. For good measure, they also sprayed other items like the salad dressings and coffee creamers. And this attack did exactly what the commune leaders hoped for. Hundreds of people got sick. But amazingly, this was really only the start of the Rajneeshis' plot to win this election. They were going to poison people's food with salmonella, but also they did intend to poison the Dalles water supply with salmonella, and one of their members did get access to the water supply, but for some unknown reason, the plan failed, and so no one got sick from the water, and therefore not enough people got sick, and so enough people turned out to vote, and so the cult's candidates lost the election, despite having bussed in all those extra homeless people to vote for them. It just wasn't enough. And so after this raid, the Rajneeshis' leader, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and his deputy, Ma Anand Sheela, were both arrested. There was not enough evidence to prove Bhagwan was behind the attack. Instead, it seemed like Sheela had sort of acted on her own. And so she was tried and found guilty for the Salmonella attack, and eventually served 29 months in prison before being deported to West Germany. As for the commune compound, it was shut down and the land was sold. Despite being vindicated, Dave and Sandy Lutkin's business, the pizza parlor, never recovered, and so they had to close it down. However, out of this, they were able to start a catering business instead, where they had much more control over who had access to their food. To this day, the Rajneeshi salad bar poisoning remains the single largest bioterrorism attack in United States history. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we do sometimes use aliases because we don't know the names of the real people involved. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said in these stories, but everything is based on research. And also a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Natalie Pritzovsky. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak